You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 335 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. And I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin and he's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's going great, Jeremy.
Well, it's cold. It's January. We had our annual Cubs convention discussion last week. And we're back for one of my favorite episodes of the year is when we get to bring on longtime friend of this podcast. We were talking just before we started that this is his 10th appearance, 10 years strong. Dan Szymborski coming on to talk Zips with us. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. And I'm a little warmer than I've been. It's actually 40 degrees where I am now, and it was like 5 degrees for several days. So it feels like spring almost.
We were saying it's been a wild ride over these last 10 years of Cubs Zips projections from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. and we've got an interesting one to break down here today.
Yeah, well, we're not at the highs or the lows. We're in the middles. So it's hard to be either too exuberant or too angry at me.
The question is, are we rising or falling? Like, which are we going? Are we ascending or descending? I feel like we're ascending, right? Maybe.
Well, the thing is, in the NL Central, as long as you haven't blown your team up, you're kind of ascending. You're like it's like a helium balloon in a way. You just kind of slowly drift up unless you blow a hole in the side of it.
We're gonna dive deep into the Zips projections, which you can find in detail over at Fangraphs.com. Look for Dan Szymborski's column there, and let's dig into it here. Let's get started. We'll start with the pitching because one of these numbers jumped out at me right off the bat, and that is the 3.2 WAR for Imanaga. This is a signing that Zips seems to be pretty excited about. He's right up there with Justin Steele for the team pitching lead.
Yeah, Zips has been into Imanaga all year. It does use the Deltagraphs data, which is kind of independent version of Fangraphs that deals with the Japanese leagues. And it thinks Imanaga is kind of underrated. You really didn't see a lot of talk about him. It was all Yamamoto. And I mean, Imanaga is a strikeout pitcher. He allows some home runs, but any pitcher coming over from Japan is going to allow more home runs in the U.S. It's just the way it is. And I think that Cubs got him at an absurdly low deal. That's good for the Cubs.
I saw your tweet when the Cubs first signed him. You thought that was the steal of the off season.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about an amount of money that, well, obviously it's a pretty nice sum of money when you talk about like me or you, but 4 years, $53 million. That's Steven.
Call that chump change.
Yeah, that's Steven Matt's money. No free agent bust ever ruins nothing. There's nothing so bad that can happen because of Steven Matt's contract. Can't destroy your franchise. It's not like you paid Chris Bryant for the outfield entering his decline phase, and he's not half the teams. Well, not really, but it's hard for this contract to go so wrong, and that's a rare thing with a pitcher when your downside isn't that bad.
And looking at the rest of the not that bad staff, I was surprised to see Jameson Taillon and Kyle Hendricks both with similar numbers coming out of Zips.
Yeah, they're Zips like Steele, Zips likes Imanaga. It's kind of on the fence. It sees Taillon and Hendricks as kind of below average-ish, but not really at the level you would call a major problem. As long as they're healthy and they eat some innings, I think the team will be generally happy with that. I don't think anyone expects like this team to say win as many games as the Braves or the Dodgers.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
think.
speaking of money, Imanaga is cheaper than Teon, and Teon was supposed to be our number 3 starter when he was signed, and he was supposed to both eat innings but also be effective. So uh, already it looks like from your projections that Imanaga's hopefully anyway going to outperform what Teon gave us last year and what you expect he'll give us this year.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been fun to have Stroman back simply because Stroman was probably a good fit for the team given the infield defense when you have Horner, when you have Swanson. But I can understand that the feelings on Stroman are more mixed than I might have for obvious reasons.
Yeah, he's not. He runs very polarizing. In terms of we like Stroman, especially when he's doing well. He really carried the team for the first half of the year. Some fans were not as happy, and I think his Twitter feed probably got him into more hot water than his pitching did. But
Yeah.
That aside, uh, the rotation doesn't look terrible. It could certainly use like a Snell or somebody if only there was one available, or maybe a Jordan Montgomery, somebody like that. That would really kind of put them over the top in the NL Central. Wouldn't you say?
And it's not preposterous for the Cubs to actually do something like that. I would rather spend that money on Blake Snell than on Bellinger. I don't know how universal that opinion will be. Snell, of course, does have flaws as a player, so does Bellinger. But I think it's a better fit for the Cubs right now. I'd be more comfortable with Pete Crow Armstrong in center and a picture of Bellinger's cost than the other way around.
It's interesting and not necessarily a crazy thing to say, frankly, under the circumstances. I guess the Cubs' retort to that would probably be, "Oh, you haven't seen our young pitchers coming up," and one who they rely on, or many fans are relying on to maybe even come up to the majors this year and be a contributor at some point later in the season, is a guy by the name of Cade Horton. What are your thoughts on him? You give him a 0.8.
Well, I think there's always a risk when you're talking about a young pitcher, and we kind of went. I don't know if we went through this, but I had similar discussions last year talking about a certain pitcher, first name Hayden Wesneski. There was like, no, he's going to be amazing. How could your projections hate him? Look what he did in the majors. I'm like, well, some
in
guys,
spring training, he was great up until the clock struck midnight, really.
And I think he will contribute in the future. For example, the home run rate is probably not going to repeat. I don't want to get too far off track, but I think there's people kind of don't realize just how risky any pitcher is really, but a young pitcher who's not really established, still finding his way in the majors and or hasn't played in the majors, that they're not certainties. You never
we grew
really
up with Kerry Wood and Mark Pryor. We know all about how this works. Lots of things can happen. Well, there's a young pitcher who you are somewhat high on in the Cubs system by the name of Ben Brown, but you are not as high on him as a starter, but more as a relief pitcher, a late inning reliever, it sounds like, or a later inning reliever, which might work out quite well given the Cubs' propensity for not spending on free agents and not really having a lot of relief pitchers to fill that role.
Yeah, Zips projects every pitcher as a starter or a reliever, and it projected Brown to have an ERA as full-time in relief in the low threes, 3.20. In a relief role, walk issues tend to not be quite as serious, simply because managers do have a little more ability to determine what situations you put a pitcher in. I think obviously you want to try someone as a starter before you make them a reliever, simply because they're going to be more valuable as a starter. But I think if Brown doesn't have an obvious role in the majors as a starter, especially this year, I think he could be a really good part of the bullpen. Probably one of the best 3 or 4 relievers out there, maybe even better than that. Zips is not really crazy about the team's bullpen once you get past Alzolay. But
because they haven't filled it yet, or because
It's complicated. Some guys it just doesn't really like all that much, but really it came in with two guys with an ERA below 4 in the projections in the bullpen. That's, at least as the projections go, a fairly shallow pen. But I think
you don't see a Drew Smiley come back, a bounce back in the bullpen this year.
I don't know. The thing with him is he doesn't feel like a guy that you really fear in the later innings. Maybe that's
That's fair.
No, he doesn't.
But then again, who was afraid of Doug Jones? Just to bring a random, like, I mean, no one was frightened of Doug Jones. No one ever thought, oh, Doug Jones is going to blow a pitch by me at 98 miles per hour. But Doug Jones was,
and he never did, right?
No, he never did. Barely kilometers. He really hit 90 kilometers an hour with that fastball. But he played 15 years in the majors and was pretty good even at the end of his career. So maybe I'm just being too mean to Smiley. One of the nice things about being left-handed is that you'll always get a chance to pitch in relief.
So how does this bullpen kind of compare to the rest of the NL Central right now? We know it's bad here, but we know the division is also bad, right? Or is there a team that's kind of pulling away there?
Well, no one in the division really has a great bullpen. Zips actually kind of likes the Pirates bullpen, which is kind of weird. They're not going to have many leads to hold, but the Pirates actually have a fairly respectable pen. It might be the highlight of their team once you get past Cabrian Hayes and O'Neill Cruz, if everything's okay there. Zips likes the Cubs pen better than the Reds. It's not in on the Reds. Likes the Cardinals bullpen a little bit more. Simply because it just likes Nick Robertson and Jojo Romero as depth beyond the Helsley and Gallegos. And once you get past there, it likes the Brewers bullpen. I think that's probably the best projected bullpen. But the Cubs, it's not I wouldn't say it's a disastrous pen. It's not. It's going to be better than the White Sox pen, for example, if the projections are anything to. But I don't think that in the case of the Cubs, unlike some of the other teams in the Central, I don't necessarily think this is the finished product. The Cubs,
we're hoping it's not. We're hoping it's not. That they add some veteran help. It'll probably end up being David Robertson for all we know. But
that's not bad. I think that would be fine. Now I would want to add Robertson plus, something more
since he's so old.
But the nice thing about an old reliever is you don't have to give him a 5-year contract for $100 million.
Right. Well, in addition to the Merriweathers and Lighters of the world, we talk about Smiley and Alzolay and Brown. I think it seems like the Cubs do have more confidence than they have had in the past about having several guys who may be kind of swing roles where they could pitch multiple innings out of the pen, spot starters. Whether that ends up being Wicks or Assad or Wisniewski or whomever, they seem to have just more. We went through a period of the last 3 or 4 years where the Cubs continually were getting veteran relief pitchers on reclamation deals. And this year it seems like they're more focused on bringing up guys who actually they've developed in their system, which is a kind of a change of pace. What do you think about that approach?
I think it always depends on what's available out there. There's kind of a trend in baseball because as innings have gone down and for starting pitching, teams have taken this approach where they're actually kind of shying away from inning eaters in a way. If you look at the Dodgers and you look at the Rays, and even the Braves, once they start having all those injuries, now the focus is just get live arms and just try to fill them in wherever you can and hope you have enough healthy simultaneously so that the disaster doesn't happen. That worked for the Dodgers last year. That's what they're kind of doing this year with adding players like Glasnow. I think that if you can develop from within, of course, that's much better financially, because even if the Cubs, when all said and done, are probably the team in the NL Central with the most ability to spend, that doesn't necessarily mean you want to spend every last dollar you have. And every dollar they save there is a dollar that you can theoretically bring in a free agent of the caliber who you didn't develop in your system.
And if they don't do that, I'm sure they'll just lower ticket prices.
Oh yeah, because that is one of the arguments that we used to have in 90s sabermetric world that we still have to argue with today. A lot of the landscape of these discussions have changed. We're no longer at the part where we have to convince people that on-base percentage and slugging percentage are useful, but you still have a lot of people who think that you raise the payroll, ticket prices will go up. And for some reason, when the payroll goes down, the ticket prices never go down.
No.
I wonder why.
Well, we do have one thing, a bone to pick with you. If I could just, Jeremy, do you have any more pitching questions?
No, I did want to note that we'll get to the fun comps later once we run through hitting. That'll come later. So no, go take it, Pat.
All right. So I would like you to do a reevaluation of Seiya Suzuki. We would like a higher WAR than 2.4 for him and the merry band of little names underneath him here at Canario and Talkman. We were hoping for maybe like a 3.2. Could we compromise on that?
Okay, let me hit F9 here and see if it changes. Seiya Suzuki. I'm hitting F9.
Yeah.
It's recalculating. It's coming up the same. I don't know what to tell you.
Is it his defense? What's going on here? Why is he not higher than 2? I guess he's 2.4, right? In WAR here.
Yeah, although I should note that Zips isn't exactly projecting like 650 plate appearances for that. So it's better than it looks. It's projecting, I think, 562. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about Suzuki is there's a lot to like about him, but he has been very up and down in the majors.
Yeah. He's been either up or down. Literally, he's either hot or he's cold.
But I don't think that the projection's a bad one. It's still projecting to be an above-average starter, and the corner outfield positions are not particularly deep in the majors. 2.4 WAR makes you probably in left and right somewhere around the 9th or 10th best starter in the league. And I don't think that's unreasonable once you look at it in that context.
So he had Hap. Hap comes in at 2.6. You say are passable. Especially in the Central.
They're fine. And really, the whole offense is fine. Even without Bellinger being re-signed and without him repeating 2023, which will be a hard thing to do. Zips has the Cubs at 2 WAR better at all but catcher, essentially. And it's a good place to be. Especially because you look at the NL Central and every other team has a significant weakness somewhere. There's no one on the Cubs in the lineup that Zips actually hates. Zips thinks that, Horner and Swanson are one of the best second base shortstop combinations in the majors right now.
Due to defense, primarily.
Yeah, that defense is pulling those numbers up pretty high, right? Like there's
only so much they could do. I mean, a projection system is only going to project a guy to be like 10, 12 runs above average because there's so much uncertainty there.
No. I think they're. See, I look at their WARs and I think they're almost generous. Whereas Suzuki, I feel like, is the other one that we're kind of hoping for. You could reevaluate would be, or we'd like to appeal. Is there an appeal process?
There's no appeal process. Even I can't appeal. It's all the algorithms. I have no authority to do anything. If
we promise to never let Chris Morel ever use a glove, or take the field in a defensive manner, could we possibly get his WAR up above 2? Or 1.6, wherever you want to put him at.
Well, let me see. Did I project what position did I project him at? Let me.
You have him at DH, and then also a tiny third base.
Actually, that's just on the depth chart.
Yeah.
Hold on a sec. For some, he's actually. If you actually listen to DH, his projection will go up simply because.
Listen to center field in one of your right there.
Yeah, because
you would do that.
Because he has the most innings there, so Zips automatically projected him as a center field. Let me reopen the whole thing, but he will actually probably go up a bit. How bad did they give
you? You have him as an OPS plus of only 108, barely above the average, and we were kind of hoping he would break out and be really good.
I'm actually surprised the defensive projection for him in center is decent. I don't expect that.
Yeah, no,
but
neither do we.
But I could say more once I have it open, but it takes a few minutes to reopen.
Yeah, we saw the lights dim across Chicago as Zips opened up here.
It's not quite a Schwarber thing, where Schwarber, he pretty much adds 2 wins to his projection if you just don't play him at DH. Morel's weird just because of the distribution. I'm looking right now at his defensive numbers in the majors and the minors.
Because that's a guy you're trying to find a spot for, and you're playing him in a bunch of different opportunities in the minors for sure.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because both his majors and minor league performance had him as a slightly better center fielder than a corner outfielder, which is really, really weird.
Yeah, and something that will never be tested in real life. With any hope. So we see him. So last year, at the age of 24, he had an OPS of 821, which is pretty good for a 24-year-old, right? Young guy.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted that to go up, and we wanted that to correspond to a higher WAR.
Well, remember, you're talking about when he was playing like 400 some plate appearances. He was kind of like on a 40 home run pace. So the home runs are definitely there, but regression toward the mean is a bit of a thing.
Yep.
He is another hot and cold guy. He runs one of two directions typically. And you have him projected at 546 at bats, which if the Cubs don't add any more offensive free agents, probably is a realistic-ish number, right? Remember, he spent the first month relegated to the minors because he must have looked at somebody weird in spring training or something while the Cubs let Eric Hosmer and company patrol the field. But we were hoping for a little bit more out of him in terms of
his projection stays pretty similar at DH, although his OPS plus does go up to 112 with the same number of home runs. But, I don't think there's a problem with him. Obviously, it'll be nice if he repeats 2023. But I don't think that the projection, again, like the rest of the offense, represents a problem for the team. I think if you're worried about Morel, or if you're worried really about any of the starters, if you're worried about Suzuki's projection, at that point, you're probably already in the lead in the NL Central if that's a problem.
Good. We're happy to be in the lead. Is there anything offensively when you look at the lineup? What if you were evaluating the Cubs, or if you were, dare say, the general manager of the Cubs, what do you think could get the most bang for the buck in terms of offensive improvement, besides like getting a catcher?
I think. Well, do you
which
mean
they could have gotten last year?
You mean in the system or going out and?
Going out, if they were to go out and acquire additional assistants.
Okay, because in system, I think they need to kind of either poop or get off the pot with Mervis. I know a lot in the organization don't really look at him very highly, but I think that is kind of a platoon bat that he does have use. And if you're not going to use that, and I don't think that they really want to, because I think he could be a good bat against righties and kind of do a pseudo platoon with Bush at times.
I mean, the fact that he hits left-handed
slide over
puts him in a unique category among the Cubs players on their roster, in that he's about the only one. So
there's
from a balance perspective.
So I think that deciding what you do with him is key, because when you look at players who are out there, some of the most interesting ones out there are DH types.
Yeah.
And at that point, you're saying, well, if we're willing to play Mervis, why would we bring in like Soler or JD Martinez or something? But if you don't have faith in him, then all of a sudden you look at him and say, maybe we bring in Soler, maybe we bring in Martinez, maybe we have a Jock Peterson reunion. I think, though, that figuring out what you're going to do with Mervis kind of affects the rest of the decision tree when you're trying to look at what's left in free agency, because outside of some DHs, there's pretty much Matt Chapman, who is not really a great fit for what the Cubs need, or Bellinger, who's still out there and still left-handed. And then once you get past them, it's a pretty thin market for hitters remaining. Like I don't think Rhys Hoskins necessarily brings anything to the table now that you've brought in Bush and you're deeper there.
I think Cubs have this weird thing going on where they've got Madrigal, they've got Wisdom, they've got Mervis, they've got Bush. They're actually, for not having, and Morel, for not having a lot of, and not to mention like 5 guys in the minors who could come up at any moment, for not having really any solidified people at first, third, DH, whatever, they sure have a lot of candidates already internally here. Anybody they brought in would just be eating away, I guess, at the people they already have.
Yeah, I think Wisdom is kind of the key to make that work because he's the most interesting as a platoon player, simply because of his proclivities, and he can, play first base, third base, pretty much wherever that they would need to play him, he can play. So I think that they kind of go not Bush. Wisdom is the center point in a way, if that makes any sense. I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head. But
you're making us feel really good about next year.
Yeah, I think the Cubs are a pretty good team. If a gunman came up to me and for some reason threatened my life and I had to pick a Cubs win total, I'd probably say 85 or 86 wins. Now some might be disappointed with that, but I think the team does have some flaws. I think the pitching staff could be a little thicker. I'd like to see more certainty at first base, DH, those positions, third base. But it's a decently built team, and it's in a division where everybody has some kind of flaw. So I think the Cubs, it's not the peak, Bryant, Rizzo, Baez years, but it's a competitive team, and I think that it wouldn't be even one raised eyebrow if they won the division in 2024.
Would the gunman ask you for your ATM card, or would you just be a bunch of advice questions?
I hope so. It'd be really weird to get held up and just like, don't you want my money? I mean, I'm going to cancel my card after you take it, but you might get there quickly because if you steal my phone too, it'll take me a while to get home and look up stuff.
Yeah.
One of the numbers that jumped out at me, I was a little surprised at the defensive projections for Pete Crow Armstrong. Here's a guy who Cubs fans have a lot of high hopes that the defense would carry the day here. Were you surprised at all to see Zips a little bullish on with the defensive numbers here for Crow Armstrong?
I think they were probably about as strong as you can expect. Plus 6 runs, I believe, better than average. Zips does have built into it. I have hit location data for every ball hit in the minors, and every year I calculate a probabilistic model of every defensive play. It's about 700,000 balls in play that I analyze through every year. It's a little similar to what Sean Smith used to do with Total Zone and the majors. Except I do it in the minors. And Crow Armstrong, I mean, he fared quite well. And if that comes to pass, that he's 6 runs above average or better, because he's been well liked by scouts. It's not a case of Zips being out of school and saying, well, I like this guy and I'm just a computer. There's good reasons to like him. And it's why one of those reasons why I'm not sweating the loss of Bellinger, because realistically, you were going to have to replace some of Bellinger because it's hard to expect 2023 to just repeat in
right. Even with Bellinger, you would have to replace some of Bellinger.
You can never, you can't sign his 2023 Bellinger. You can only sign 2024 and going forward Bellinger. And I think that's fine for a lot of teams, but the Cubs are well equipped here. I think Crow Armstrong is going to be not necessarily a superstar or anything, but I think he's going to make it. And the difference between him and Bellinger in 2024 will be smaller than I think a lot of people expect.
All right, Pat, any more on the hitting side before we get into some fun with comps?
One last hitting question for you. The Cubs also have a fair number of younger players still in the minors, Canario being one of them, who may come up at some time. We talked very briefly about Bush. But there's also Matt Shaw, who I think they're holding out hope will be the third baseman at some point this year. So they've got some intriguing possibilities in addition to their onslaught of mediocre veterans. So what's your take on that?
Well, Shaw is interesting. Shaw actually got a pretty good projection, OPS plus just under 100, which is not bad for a minor leaguer.
For a guy who was drafted less than a year ago.
Yeah, it's almost like one of those Angels draft picks, because the Angels don't do much well at all, but they do seem to do a pretty good job recognizing players who can contribute in the majors fairly quickly, with Zach Neto and Nolan Shanwell. I think that there is a chance that you do see some Shaw, and plus there is some positional flexibility there, which could come in handy. He might eventually make Nick Madrigal a little superfluous on the team, but
fine.
Yeah, I imagine they'll probably start him in AAA, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, or Double A. I mean, he batted fewer than 100 times in Double A last year, right?
Yeah, I think it depends on how they feel about his defense at third. I guess they'll have a better idea in the spring. They might not have like an exact plan of where to start him off, to be honest. I think maybe they'll see where he is at third, because he only played, I think, a few games at third. He was mostly second base and shortstop in his first minor league season. But he's a really, really interesting player, and he could be one of the first of the 2023 draft class to really contribute. Him and what's his face in Texas? Why can't Langford. I couldn't remember his name.
Okay.
I was saying Wyatt something.
So you think Shaw's a real possible player here? You've got Bush down as being somebody who, I mean, you see again, he's been in the majors, but only for a cup of coffee. Interesting.
And Zips likes like Bush a lot.
Yeah,
Zips really likes.
He had a cup of coffee and it was kind of mediocre to bad. But you think that Zips is telling us that was not the real Bush that we're going to see this year?
No, Zips is into him. I think there's still questions about what defensive position he can really hack it in the majors at. Minor league data for him at third actually isn't really bad or anything, but it does kind of clash with the reputation. And I know the team is going to be, fairly conservative about how much they use him at third base, but there is pretty good potential there.
All right, let's dig into some comps here. Pat, we'll start with you. What was one of your favorite comps that jumped off the page?
Well, for as much as Dan has been bagging on our bullpen, I have to say, Julian Merriweather's comp, his number one comp, is Raleigh Fingers, Hall of Famer with the handlebar mustache. If our number 3 guy out of the pen is the equivalent of a Hall of Fame reliever like Raleigh Fingers, I feel pretty good about our bullpen for next year. What do you say about that, Dan?
Especially if he can have a nice Raleigh mustache.
Yeah,
I love using Raleigh Fingers in MLB The Show. He's one of my favorite relievers to have at the back of my rosters.
How did Julian Merriweather get his comp? Did he pay for it? Was it sponsored or something? Like, how does that work?
Well, I'd have to kind of trace it with the year, because the comps that you see in Zips are essentially the baseline comps. It compares the baseline at the current moment for a player versus the comp at every other moment in their career in history.
So Merriweather's 32 right now.
And this was Fingers. This was Padres era Fingers. This was post Oakland. So he's a little bit off peak now. He was starting to have he had that 1 year where
he had that 1 year with a 4.52 ERA.
Yeah, and
same year as Merriweather. So you're kidding me. So the one bad year Raleigh Fingers ever had is the comp for this. I gotcha.
Well, his FIP numbers were also coming down a bit because his strikeout rate was dropping. In the early 70s, I think he even got to strike out an inning a couple times. I'd have to actually type.
Well, he was throwing over 100 innings. I know they don't do that anymore, but over 100 innings a year, which is unheard of for relievers today.
Yeah,
134 innings, 132 innings.
It's weird. 70s baseball got a lot of things wrong, but I actually think they had a good idea on how to maximize the utility of relievers. But that's a whole rant from another day. But then Fingers kind of had that late career renaissance with the Brewers. He had the Cy Young year, which no one would give. It's hard to get a Cy Young. In the mid 80s, they loved to give, since the modern closer thing was kind of a new concept.
Former Cub Willie Hernandez found himself with an MVP and a Cy Young award.
Yeah,
Who knew?
And the Mark Davis year, and it was like they
Steve
loved.
Bedrosian got a Cy Young over Rick Sutcliffe when he should not have. In 87 or 8.
The writers kind of went nuts then. Hopefully we're better at voting now than we were then.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't know it from the Hall of Fame ballot.
Yeah,
but anyway.
That's a separate discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, my feelings have gotten much more negative about some of my colleagues the last day or so, because there's just been this run from Ryan Thibodeau's tracker where it's like all these really bad ballots were kind of like turned in like one large bundle. It's like, okay, the meth head precinct is coming in. Let's vote for Torrey Hunter, but not Joe Mauer.
No, Joe Mauer's had a rough week.
Yeah, Joe Mauer, I don't think he's going to get in the first year. I think it's going to be Beltre and nobody else. I don't think Helton's going to do it. I don't think Wagner's going to do it.
Poor Bobby Abreu is a lot better than I remember, because he was so consistent. Beltran too. Carlos Beltran again.
Yeah, Beltran was terrific.
Get off subject. Yeah.
I mean, I can understand someone saying Bobby Abreu is on the wrong side of my line. I think they're wrong, and I think they're kind of very retrograde in analysis, because let's be honest, there's a contingent of very old school writers who are not really that good as analysts. Me, I'm not a good reporter, but I'm a pretty good analyst, I think. But I can understand saying, okay, Bobby Abreu is not on my line, but Torrey Hunter and Jose Bautista are, and not Beltran. Okay, thanks, crazy man. I'm glad you have a vote.
Speaking of borderline Hall of Famers, I noticed Dansby Swanson's comp was very interesting to me. It was Joe Cronin, of all people, who lived to be 77, and he's been dead for 78 years. So a little bit remote for us today, but he was a near Hall of Famer himself. So that's a pretty good comp for Dansby, don't you think?
No, Cronin was pretty good, and he is in the Hall of Fame.
Is he?
There are some questions about him as a person, but these comps aren't really person related.
No.
You're right. He is in the Hall of Fame. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, and
65, a WAR of almost 65. That's pretty good for.
I was really annoyed because someone got mad because I linked the wrong Joe Cronin in the comps, because we have a player linker that links players to match things up, and I accidentally linked Joe Cronin, the minor league infield outfield utility guy for the Twins a few years ago. Like, how can you say Dansby's that bad? He's a star. Joe Cronin was a star. I'm like, no, it was the other Joe Cronin. I made a mistake. Jeez.
I didn't even think of it in terms of possible minor leaguer. I just assumed it was the Joe Cronin who was very good.
One thing I've discovered just doing the back end stuff for Fangraphs, getting the players all linked in these articles, is there's a lot of players who have players with similar or identical names that you forgot about. Like, every time I talk about Juan Soto, it asks you, like, if I want one of the other Juan Sotos. I avoid saying Johan Santana because our player linker will instead find Johan Santa and link him, and I have to remember every time I mention Santana to unlink him from Johan Santa, who was in the Dominican leagues for the Rangers like a decade ago. So these are the inside Fangraphs stories that are interesting to nobody but me.
No, our listeners will get a kick out of it as well for sure. And I got a kick out of looking at Jamison Tyone here, Jeremy Guthrie as his pitching comp, and his pitching comp 3 was Cubs legend Jeff Samardzija.
Yeah, I don't know if I would trust him as much to be a wide receiver as. I do keep all 6 like in my big spreadsheet, all the top 6. There's also Jordan Zimmerman and Bartolo Colon, who had his moment as a pop culture baseball beloved. Also apparently has like 2 families, but that's another story.
He's a fantastic immaculate grid play too.
Yeah, he is. Kyle Hendricks got a little bit of a ding here. You gave him Brandon Looper as his comparator.
I like the Looper.
Yeah, we like Kyle Hendricks, but I guess he is getting old.
I mean, the Looper, he did a great job, and he was the kid in Bad News Bears, and then he pitched in the majors after that. They won one for the Looper, and you know he was one of the few pitchers who really successfully relieved for a long time and then converted back to starting late in his career with mixed results. But it's pretty rare for a guy to go from being a reliever to an actual inning-eating starter. It's basically like him and C.J. Wilson in the last 30 years.
Did any comps for you, Dan, jump off the page?
I'm a little worried because it didn't. It's the 4th comps, so it didn't register on the site. But Justin Steele did get Tommy John, which is always scary. You don't want to see his name. But he also got John Danks, who I guess also isn't that positive since he blew out everything. Let's see. I'm looking for. Let's see.
I don't think Nico Horner is going to appreciate his Joey Cora comparison.
Wesneski probably doesn't want his James Baldwin.
No.
Oh, Drew Smiley got J Happ. We were talking about Happ money. We got a wrong Negro in there.
You gave Joe, former Cub. You gave Bush a terrible comp for Cubs fans. His second comp is Jeff Blauser, who famously was signed as a free agent by the Cubs after his one All-Star campaign in Atlanta, and he promptly never hit the ball in the infield again, and then was out of baseball in 2 years.
But the good thing is that's compared to 20s Jeff Blauser. He can still sign with the Rockies in 10 years and ruin their team.
Gotcha.
Let's see.
Poor Ian Happ got Lee Mazzilli, future Mickey Mantle for the Mets, never to be. But then he also did Ben Zobrist, which I think we'll take.
We love Ben Zobrist.
Crow Armstrong got Felix P.A., which I don't know if you'd be happy with.
Yeah, we remember him. No, we're not.
I was disappointed as a youngster.
That's our real life fear is that Pete Crow Armstrong turns into another Felix P.A. type.
I was always kind of disappointed that his name wasn't Felix Pie. I don't know. Let's see. Mike Talkman has George Burns, which I think is the 30s outfielder, not the comedian. Let's see. Nick Punto.
Mike Talkman also had Kosuke Fukudome as his second comp.
Madrigal has Miguel Cairo.
There you go.
And Mike's
it's like a trip down memory lane, but none of it good. So you have Cody Bellinger listed on the Cubs. You must know something we don't.
I just list everybody with their most recent team. So there's always some guys there that were like
Hosmer's still June. On this list. Yeah,
you still have to get to look at Hosmer, but every team has a player they released in June, which they rather not look at.
When I saw the first comp for Cody Bellinger, I'm like, well, I'm glad the Cubs didn't re-sign him because it's Bill Sample, the Texas Ranger whose baseball card I have, but a complete nondescript nobody, even at his best. I don't understand how Zips must hate Bellinger.
Well, Jacoby Ellsbury is 4th, which also doesn't really no one says, hey, we should sign Cody Bellinger because he reminds me of Jacoby Ellsbury.
I mean, at this point in his career, Bill Sample had an OPS plus in his age 29 season of 68. Like, that's not good. So I hope that's not real. Is there any way that was a mistake? Could the machine have made an error?
No, it's pretty. I could get you the exact year, but I think that'd be. But he's not. I don't think you have to worry about it until the Cubs like give him 180 million or something. Then you should probably worry about it. Because Bellinger, I know I've ragged on him a lot. Generally speaking, from a projection standpoint, the improvement in batting average as a pro on strike twos, it'll probably keep his batting average from falling, but it's not believing the when you talk about the offensive numbers, because even if you think he's going to be a terrific two-strike hitter now, it's really hard to buy that much power with the lack of velocity. And it's not like when he was successful, he was with the Dodgers at his peak, that he was doing it without hitting the ball hard. He was hitting the ball hard in those days.
So Jeremy has a question for you, speaking of Cody Bellinger.
So we're looking for what's a projection on a Bellinger contract? What we've talked a lot about him today. If
Zips, actually, I actually had it open for this. Zips would offer him, which would not be accepted, mind you, would offer him 6 years, 109 million.
That's probably what Jed's offering him.
I bet it is.
Here we are.
I think it depends really on the team what you offer him. If you're a contending team right now and you have a desperate need for a center fielder, I think you overpay for that war because you get more utility out of it. I don't think that if you're a team rebuilding or a team that's absolutely stacked that you want to do that. And I think if not for the existence of Pete Crow Armstrong, I'd probably be more in favor of the Cubs giving him most of what he wants and hopefully bringing him back. I just think that the Cubs, it's just not a weakness for the Cubs. I think Bellinger fulfilled what they wanted from him, to have a 1-year pillow deal, be awesome, and get us to the next center fielder. And I think that's what he did. And if he goes somewhere else, and even if he's successful somewhere else, I don't think there's much to really regret, because there are significant risks when signing him.
It certainly seems like in order to sign him, a team would realistically probably have to go to 8 years, unless it really just completely collapses in terms of the market.
I just can't do that. I mean, I don't have 150 million, so I'm not going to be making that offer.
Oh, and it wouldn't even be 150. It'd probably be even at 180 million. That's only 22 a year. So I'm sure they want more than that, but boy, that's
I don't have a great feel, because sometimes you have kind of a feel from talking to people like what teams are talking about. I have no feel for where teams really are on Bellinger right now. The thing is, Boris is and really any top agent is really good at the public relations game. When JD Martinez was a free agent several years ago, you saw talk of like $200 million. Some of it, I think, was with Scott Boras, who was getting that idea out there. But in the end, he didn't sign for anywhere near that. It was like 113 he signed for with the Red Sox or something. I'm probably misremembering the number, but it was in that vicinity. So it's possible that Bellinger doesn't get that huge deal. But
I guarantee you, the day that Zips came out, Jed picked up the phone and called Boros with that comp to Billy Sample and was like, "See, I told you. Look at this."
That's
how often does that happen? Do you think?
It's hard to say, because the thing is, I mean, a number of teams do buy like the full, Zips whole career projections for everyone, but I don't really know how they use it, and I kind of have to keep a wall between myself and teams. I can't offer any advice or counsel in any way. It's just, can you sell us X data? And then I say, yeah, sure, it costs Y dollars, and then I hit a button and I send it. So it's hard to tell what teams are using it for, despite some guesses. I mean, presumably they're using it somehow. Maybe they're using it and just taking the opposite of every projection. But if it wasn't useful in some way, I don't think they'd give me money for it. That'd be a weird transaction, because teams don't like to give people money for things if they can help it.
Yeah.
So I can hardly know. Sometimes you get a clue though. There was a player, I can't say who, but about 10 years ago, His team asked for his full projection. His agent asked for his full projection. So I sold the same projection to both the player and the agent, and they signed a contract for basically what the projection said. And I was like, yeah,
Really?
Nice.
Nice.
It wasn't like a huge, like $300 million contract or anything, but in that case,
it wasn't a Cub player, I assume, right?
it was not a Cub. It was not a Chicago Cub. I will say that. It was,
what were the initials? What were the initials of the player? Just out of curiosity.
okay, the player exists and is alive.
Okay,
That's
so
good.
Joe Cronin, it was not. Gotcha.
Yeah, not Joe Cronin.
Joe Cronin.
And exists.
Oh, here's
not
a little
Tungsten Armo Doyle.
for future purposes. If anybody asks you about the Joe Cronin Dansby Swanson comp, little known fact: you may recall the famous 1934 All-Star Game when Carl Hubble struck out 5 immortals in succession. Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Fox, Al Simmons, and Joe Cronin. He was the 5th one.
That one. Oh God! Now
You're
I'm
speechless.
No. There was a picture. I forget who, but his comps were all over the place. It was one of those lefty hard throws. It might have been Tanner Scott as a prospect, but his top 3 comps at the same age were Randy Johnson, good,
Yeah.
Carl Hubble, also good, and
Yep.
Jonathan Sanchez of the Giants.
Well, one of those turned out to be closer than the other two. So,
Dan, it's always a great time catching up with you, breaking down the Cubs zips. It's always fun. I can't believe it's already been 10 years of doing this with you. It's always a pleasure. Please remind all of our listeners where they can find your work on the internet and how they can follow you on your social media platforms.
Well, you can find me almost entirely at fangraphs.com. Once in a while, I do something with ESPN still. And you can find me at D. Szymborski on Twitter and Blue Sky, or X, if we're going to call it that, but I'm not going to.
we don't. We call it Twitter.
I don't like the name because I keep seeing the logo and I think it's the X to close a window. And I get really mad when I click on the X and nothing happens.
You're talking about Chicagoans who refer to the Sears Tower, which hasn't been called the Sears Tower in probably 20 years. You know, we keep to traditional names.
I still call it the Sears Tower. See, the thing is about sponsorship deals is no one paid me for anything. It's always going to be the Oakland Coliseum unless you pay the Dan endorsement fee for
Right,
Dan to recognize it. That's just how I am. And thankfully, thanks for having me on, guys. And thankfully, you guys are going to be nicer than any White Sox podcast I go on in the next week, because those projections were
they know what's coming. This won't be a surprise. This is not going to be a surprise to any of them.
I'm surprised they have any outstanding podcasts really at this point, given the situation they got going on there. That's just brutal.
Well, with that, we are going to wrap it up. We're going to call it a podcast. We do want to send well wishes to Ryan Sandberg, who announced he shared his cancer diagnosis today. So terrible news. We wish all the best to one of our favorite Cubs of all time, Ryan Sandberg. Pat.
Yeah, as we go through this season, one of the things that we talked about last week that we're going to do is a retrospective on the 1984 season. Next week we'll have another feature on that, and Ryan Sandberg, of course, played an integral role. In fact, the 84 Cubs and Ryan Sandberg are sort of synonymous with each other, because as Ryan Sandberg rose to prominence and won the MVP and was an All-Star and a Gold Glover and a Silver Slugger, so too did the Cubs after 12 years of being not over 500, ascend to first place in the NL East at the time. And really the Cubs' success and Sandberg's success over the course of the 80s were very intricately tied. And he's just, a very upstanding guy, really good person, and a good family. We feel terribly for them, and our thoughts are with them, in this difficult time.
Absolutely, and with that, we're going to wrap it up. I'm looking forward to more 1984 content. We'll have that all throughout the season, and so make sure you're following us on all of our social media platforms throughout the season. That's Twitter, X, Threads, Instagram, Blue Sky. We're on all of them at Wrigleyville Nat. That's where you can find us. Also, Facebook.com/Wrigleyville Nation as well. And the YouTube channel where we'll hopefully have video podcasts coming up. Right now, the audio version is up there, so go ahead and subscribe on the YouTube page as well. That helps us work the algorithm so other Cub fans can find the show. So go search for Wrigleyville Nation Podcast over there. Throw us likes and subscribes. And hopefully the video version of the podcast will be up there as soon as the season gets started. And all of the links I described, the Patreon, everything to support the show, all of the back catalog, everything is available at the website, WrigleyvilleNation.com. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.